She thought she knew the man she loved, until one moment changed everything. In a life that looked perfect on the surface, cracks began to form. Small at first, almost invisible. But behind the smiles were secrets, behind the promises were lies, and behind the love was betrayal waiting to be revealed. When the truth finally comes crashing down, it doesn't just break her heart, it ignites something stronger. Because this time, she won't be the victim. She'll be the one who takes control, who rises from the ruins, and who proves that losing everything can be the beginning of becoming unstoppable. The lesson? Sometimes the truth hurts, but it also sets you free. The people who betray you don't define you. How you rise after does. Strength isn't about never falling, it's about refusing to stay down. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and support the channel. Your support means everything and helps us create more powerful stories like this. Thanks for watching.
With her due date just 7 weeks away, her husband told her the piano had to go, not because it was out of tune or they were downsizing, but because his lead architect, the woman orchestrating his new skyscraper, needed the grand living room to display a massive architectural model. And it didn't stop there. The architect, Kendall, had the priceless Bosendorfer moved by a standard crew, leaving a deep gash in the antique wood. She referred to Isla, a former concert cellist, as Julian's very sweet but overly sensitive wife, who was lucky he was so focused on their future. And the husband, the real estate magnate who built a 10-figure empire from concrete and charisma, let her. Every single time, he chose the deal. What neither of them knew was that the quiet woman they treated like a fragile piece of glass, the wife they saw as just a supportive partner, was the sole inheritor of the $300 billion Valerius global shipping dynasty. For 3 years, she had hidden who she was, desperate for a love that saw her soul, not her shares. Now she had her answer, and the call she was about to make would shatter their world. The lesson of this story is vital. It's a truth most people learn when it's much too late. You should never measure a person's influence by how loudly they speak. The most reserved individual in a room is often the one who holds all the cards, and the person you dismiss today could very well be the one who owns your destiny tomorrow. True love isn't about making the convenient choice. It's about making the right one, with integrity, without fail. If this story strikes a chord with you, if it reminds you of your own quiet strength or of someone in your life being utterly underestimated, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Tell me, have you ever been fundamentally misunderstood by the very people who were supposed to know you best? I read every single one, and if this is your first time here, please subscribe and enable notifications. We tell stories about resilience, about justice, and about people who refuse to be diminished. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. We need to move the piano into storage for a little while. My lead architect needs the space, Julian said, his gaze locked on the blueprints covering their dining table. The stark light from the overhead lamp made him look like a stranger. For a moment, Isla was certain she had misheard. She stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the great room, her hand resting on the curve of her belly. 7 months. The baby stirred with a sharp, insistent kick, as if he already grasped a reality his mother was struggling to process. "I'm sorry, what?" Isla asked. "Kendall is flying in from London tomorrow," Julian said, his pen still marking up the plans. "She's bringing the final presentation model for the Thorn Tower. We're hosting the primary investors here. She needs the living room as a showroom. The climate-controlled storage downtown is perfectly safe for the piano. It's just until we secure the funding. Just until we secure the funding." The words felt like swallowing dust. Isla had just spent the last 2 days with a specialist tuner, ensuring the antique Bosendorfer was perfect. It was her grandmother's, the only piece of her old life she had brought into this new one. She wanted her son to grow up hearing her play. "Julian, I'm 7 months pregnant," she said, her voice steady. She had perfected steady. "Playing helps with the stress. The acoustics in this room are perfect. My doctor said it's important to—" "Isla." He finally looked up. He wore the expression he used in boardrooms when a junior associate pointed out a flaw in his logic. It was a look of profound impatience. She is my lead architect. This is a $2 billion project. Let's not create unnecessary drama. Let's not create unnecessary drama. As if her history, her solace, and the child she was carrying were just trivial complications on his blueprint for success. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. Fine, she whispered. Later that week, she went to the storage unit. It was a vast, sterile facility with concrete floors and rolling metal doors. The piano, draped in a thick moving blanket, looked like a caged beast. The air was cold and smelled of dust and stillness, nothing like the sun-filled living room where it belonged. Hila sat on a nearby crate, the unfamiliar silence pressing in on her. She laid both hands over her belly. "It's okay, little one," she whispered to her son. "We're okay." But her hands were shaking, not from anger, but from the brutal clarity of it. She was an afterthought. After the deal, after the firm, after his reputation, after his ambition, and after Kendall. She was 6th on his list. Their son was 7th. She leaned her head against the cold metal door of the storage unit and stared at the opposite wall. A long, thin crack ran down the concrete, a silent testament to stress and pressure that no one had bothered to repair. She inhaled for a count of 4, held it, and exhaled for a count of 6. It was a breathing exercise her doctor had taught her, a tool for managing anxiety, a way to count seconds instead of shouting all the things she truly felt. In their penthouse across town, Julian's phone buzzed with a message. His reply was immediate. His voice was a low murmur as he spoke into his phone, but the words echoed in her mind as if he were standing right there. "It's handled. She's fine with it. You know Hila, she's accommodating." Accommodating? She pressed the heels of her palms against her eyes until she saw bursts of light. She was accommodating. The next morning, Hila woke at dawn, her body aching from a restless sleep. She went to the kitchen, brewed the dark roast coffee Julian favored, and laid out the vitamins he always forgot to take. She had memorized the 1,000 tiny details of his life. She was still waiting for him to learn a single one of hers. At 9 o'clock, she decided to go back to the storage unit. She wanted to see the piano again, to run her hand over the familiar curve of the lid. She unlocked the unit and pulled up the heavy door. She unwrapped a corner of the moving blanket. A long, white gash ran diagonally across the polished ebony wood. A deep, ugly wound. It wasn't just a scratch. The wood was splintered. Taped to the blanket was a note. The handwriting a sharp, aggressive slant she recognized as Kendall's. "Had to rush the crew to get the model set up. A bit of a scuff, but fixable. We'll get it buffed out after the close. K?" Hila read the note 4 times. She folded it into a tiny, precise square and put it in her pocket. She stood completely still. The hum of the facility's climate control system was the only sound, a machine working to preserve an instrument that had already been desecrated. She touched the splintered wood. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried. Lately, she had begun to think that was the whole problem. Kendall arrived at noon. She strode into the penthouse like a storm front, her energy sharp and commanding. She was dressed in a severe architectural gray dress and wore an expression of intense focus. She smelled of expensive leather and a perfume that could have been called closing. "Hila," Kendall said, her greeting abrupt. She didn't bother with a handshake. Her eyes swept the living room, now dominated by a miniature city of glass and steel. So much better. That piano was sucking all the modern energy out of the space. "Hello, Kendall," Hila replied. "Good flight?" "Efficient. The zoning board in Singapore is proving difficult, but they'll fold." She strode past Isla and tapped the enormous model. "I had new lighting installed this morning. Cooler tones. It makes the steel look more aggressive. Better for the presentation." She glanced at the small framed photo of Isla's parents on a side table. "That's a bit distracting." Julian emerged from his office. He greeted Kendall with a quick, professional hug that lingered just a fraction of a second too long. Kendall's smile was a rare flash of warmth. reserved exclusively for him. "Julian," she said, her hand resting on his arm, "you look exhausted. Have you been sleeping?" "I'm fine, Kay. Ready to build." "You need to be at 100%. I'll have a proper dinner brought in tonight. You can relax," she said with a sidelong glance at Isla. "You look like you could use an early night." That evening, they ate Michelin-starred steak out of cardboard boxes. Kendall had ordered for all of them. She served Julian his cut first, then her own. Almost as an afterthought, she nudged a box in Isla's direction. "Decided on a name yet?" Kendall asked, cutting a piece of filet. "We're considering Sebastian," Isla said quietly, "after Bach." "Sebastian Thorne," Kendall mused, testing the syllables. "It's a little soft, don't you think? You want something with more impact. Something that sounds like a CEO, like Sterling or Corbin?" She said it with a slight chuckle, a sound that framed Isla's choice as quaint and irrelevant. Isla looked at Julian, waiting. He was meticulously arranging his food on the plate. He said nothing. The silence stretched for 5 seconds. 5 seconds is nothing unless you're waiting for the man who promised to cherish you, to defend you, and the son you're carrying. Then it's an eternity. Isla set her fork down. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm feeling a little tired." She walked to their bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed. She touched the cool screen of her phone. She did not weep. She would not grant them her tears. Not anymore. It was never about the piano. It was about the 5 seconds. She smelled the faint scent of Kendall's perfume lingering in the room when she came back. Giselle had placed a minimalist chrome sculpture on the grand piano. "A piece by Brancusi's protege," she announced. "It commands the space, gives it intention." She was systematically curating their home, stripping away every warm, personal touch of Serafina's, erasing her very presence. Serafina sank deeper into the velvet armchair. Her tea was cold now, untouched. She stared out at the bay. Over the next 3 days, Giselle's takeover of the penthouse was absolute. She directed the movers to replace Serafina's antique rugs with stark, geometric ones. She instructed the household manager on a new, more formal protocol for serving guests. She swapped out the family vacation photos on the digital displays with a cycling gallery of architectural renderings of Marcus's latest skyscraper. And she talked. She talked endlessly about Marcus's ambition, his aesthetic, the powerful women he associated with. "That developer from Dubai was a force," Giselle commented on the second evening. "Amara Al-Jamil, her family basically owns the new financial district. They would have been an unstoppable pair." "But Marcus chose you," her smile implied, as if it were a charming, inexplicable whim. Serafina gathered the empty espresso cups. That night, lying awake in the guest room's stiff bed, Serafina thought of the woman she was before this life, the woman who restored masterpieces, the woman who understood value, not just price. She remembered who she was before Marcus, before this glass-walled Miami penthouse, before her world had been so expertly tailored around her that it felt like a beautiful, suffocating cage. She met him in a dusty, sun-drenched restoration studio in Wynwood, the humid air thick with the smell of turpentine and old canvas. She was painstakingly cleaning a 16th century Venetian oil painting, her hair tied up in a messy bun, wearing a paint-splattered linen apron over a simple dress. No security detail, no chauffeur, no mention of the family name that could make auction paddles fly and museum directors tremble. He'd strode in, the vibrant energy of the arts district clinging to him, and asked who was in charge. She'd shown him the delicate work she was doing. He said he admired her patience. She said she was an independent art restorer, which was entirely true. She restored priceless works of art, just usually for the $80 billion global auction house her family had founded 5 generations ago. She left out the part where her grandfather had discovered 2 lost Rembrandts, the part where she sat on the acquisitions board, and the part where her personal collection could buy his entire real estate portfolio, and he'd never even know it was for sale. Their first date was at a loud, trendy Cuban restaurant. He talked for 2 hours straight about his projects, his vision, his unyielding drive to reshape the city's skyline. His portfolio was worth nearly $100 million, a fact he wore like a badge of honor. He'd built it all himself. No family connections, no Ivy League endowment, just raw nerve and a hunger to build things that would last. She found his passion intoxicating back then. He had built a $100 million empire, and it was the center of his universe. She had been born into 80 billion and had spent her life trying to be seen for who she was, not what she was worth. He never asked about her other clients. He never inquired about her family. He never typed her name into a search engine. In those early days, she mistook his self-absorption for a noble respect for her privacy. Only much later did she realize it was a profound, unbreachable narcissism. He wasn't curious about her world because he was the sun, moon, and stars of his own. They were married within a year, a quiet, impossibly elegant ceremony at the Vizcaya Gardens with just 50 guests. Serafina's side was notably sparse. Her grandfather, Elias, was there, his quiet gravitas making the champagne taste more expensive. Her cousin, Sébastien, flew in from Paris, pulled her into a quiet alcove, and murmured, "Are you truly sure about this, mon coeur?" She was sure. She was so brilliantly, naively sure, in the way only someone who has never truly been at risk can be. Marcus's lead architect, Giselle, was at the wedding. A vital business partner, he'd called her. She surveyed the lush, romantic gardens with a sharp, assessing gaze. "It's very historical," she'd said to Serafina, who had paid for the whole affair from an account she told Marcus was a small inheritance from her mother. The small inheritance was the $50 million proceeds from the sale of a minor Degas sculpture. Now, curled on a silk settee in her private study, she mentally unspooled the reel of their courtship. Marcus bringing her coffee at the studio, Marcus calling her his muse, his calm in the storm, in a voice that made her feel cherished and understood. Each memory was now tainted, not because it was false, but because she could finally read the fine print. He loved her when she was a beautiful, static object in his dynamic world, when she was admiring, when she was uncomplicated. The word hung in the air, uncomplicated. From his office down the hall, she could hear Marcus's booming voice on a call. He laughed. "No, she's incredible. A bit of an old soul, but genuine. She'll be an amazing mother." Serafina placed a hand on her belly. The baby kicked, a sudden, insistent thump against her palm. "I hear him," she thought. "I hear him too." The next morning, Marcus told her he had a surprise. "Giselle put us in touch with her interior designer. He's the best in South Florida, does all the celebrity homes." "She's already booked him for us," Marcus said, grinning. "He's going to consult on the nursery." "I have a design," Serafina said, her voice even. "I was going to paint a mural. I've already sourced the antique crib from an estate in Provence." "Babe," Marcus said, the pet name a velvet glove on an iron fist. "I'm sure that's sweet, but this is Giselle's personal designer. This is premier. Our son deserves the best, doesn't he?" He was already glancing at his watch, his mind on a zoning meeting. "I want to do it myself," Serafina said, her voice soft but unyielding. "It's personal to me. My mother painted." "They can incorporate your ideas," Marcus cut in, waving a dismissive hand. "Giselle said he's brilliant at managing client input." "She said," Serafina echoed, the phrase tasting like ash. "I'm just trying to build our brand, Sarah. This is a great connection for us." "You're trying to let your architect brand my child's nursery." The penthouse, usually filled with the soft hum of the city, went dead silent. Marcus set down his tablet, his charming facade dissolving into hardened impatience. The smell of gardenias from the terrace suddenly seemed cloying, funereal. "Serafina," he said, using his warning tone, the one that meant, "Don't make this a problem, asterisk. Giselle is doing us a massive favor. Just agree to the meeting. It's one consultation. Say thank you. Say thank you to the woman he was sleeping with. the woman who was now trying to decorate the life of the child she carried. Serafina looked at her husband, really studied his face. She searched for a flicker of the man who had been captivated by her in that dusty studio, for any sign he saw her as a person with her own history, her own talent. There was none. His eyes were simply annoyed, waiting for her to acquiesce. The easy wife, the grateful, uncomplicated woman. "Fine," Serafina heard herself say. The word was a betrayal of every strong woman in her bloodline. Later, in the empty room meant for the nursery, she sat on the polished floor and examined her own hands. They were skilled hands, precise, hands that could spot a forgery from 20 paces, hands that had held her grandfather's when her grandmother passed, hands that had restored the faded glory of 100 masterpieces. She pressed them to her round belly. Her son kicked back, a sharp, determined thud. "I'm not simple," she whispered to him. "He just needs me to be." She said it like an axiom, because it was. The discovery didn't come from a lipstick-stained collar. It came from a magazine. Marcus was in Zurich for a conference. A text chimed on her phone from a friend in New York. It was a link to a feature in Architectural Digest *. The message read, "Wow, the penthouse looks stunning. You and Marcus are a true power couple." Serafina's heart went cold. She hadn't done a photo shoot. She clicked the link. The title was "The King of the Miami Skyline." The photo showed Marcus and Giselle laughing together in her living room, posing in his office. And then she saw it. In a wide shot of the office, on the wall behind Marcus's desk, was a small 17th century Dutch portrait, a private gift from her grandfather. But it wasn't the painting that made her stop breathing. It was the woman in the photo. She zoomed in on Giselle, who was leaning against the desk, radiant. Around her neck was a one-of-a-kind vintage lapis lazuli locket, a locket Serafina knew intimately. She had restored it a year ago for a client who had insisted on anonymity. She remembered the delicate, almost impossible repair to the hinge. She remembered the secret inscription the client had requested for the inside. To M, my foundation. G, to Marcus, from Giselle. The magazine article confirmed it. "You need a partner who can operate at this level," Marcus was quoted. "Giselle understands the scale of the vision. My wife, Sarah, is my sanctuary. She keeps me grounded. She appreciates the simple, beautiful things in life." The betrayal wasn't just the affair. It was the public narrative, the calculated dismissal of her entire being, printed in glossy ink for the world to see. She didn't weep. The emotion was glacial, crystalline. It was rage, a pure, clarifying rage that burned away all the fog. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. Elias answered on the first ring, his voice calm and lethal. "Serafina," he said, "I've been waiting for this call. What has he done?" "He thinks I'm ornamental," Eliza murmured, her tone unnervingly calm. There was a beat of silence on the other end of the line. "He thinks, pardon me? He called me his muse," she clarified. "Said I was the beautiful idea, but Serafina was the execution." A sharp intake of breath. Then Maya's voice, cold and precise, stripped of all comfort. "Eliza, tell me you are finished with him. Give me the word, and I will have his company's funding rounds audited into the Stone Age by morning." A dry, cracking sound that might have been a laugh escaped Eliza's lips. It was followed by a single, gut-wrenching sob that shook her entire frame. Maya didn't offer empty reassurances. She didn't promise it would all be fine. She simply held the line, a silent anchor in the storm. Once Eliza's breathing evened out, Maya spoke. "Start from the beginning." And Eliza did. The smart watch notification. The bioethicist. Serafina at the fundraiser. The slow, methodical erosion of her identity until she was just a story he told at dinner parties. Maya, who ran one of Boston's most feared venture capital firms, listened without interruption. This was Maya's process. "You already know my thoughts on this," Maya said when she was done. Don't say it. You built him a pedestal, Eliza. Now you're angry he's looking down on you. You're standing in a historic Beacon Hill brownstone, pregnant and devastated over a man who thinks a $50 million valuation is generational wealth. That's cruel. Is it? You wanted him to feel like a titan, so you pretended to be a tourist in his world. He's not a titan, Eli. He's just a man who caught a lucky break in the biotech boom. Eliza swiped at her tears with the cuff of her sweater. The lights of the city twinkled across the Charles River, a kingdom she had a claim to. For the first time in years, she felt like she was seeing it with her own eyes. Maya was more than a best friend. She was the custodian of Eliza's real life. They were suitemates at MIT. Maya was the only person who understood the true scale of the Hayes industrial fortune and the only one who had pleaded with Eliza not to trade it all for a fairy tale. You said you wanted to be chosen for yourself, Maya said, her voice softening. Not for your patent portfolio, not for your board seat, just for you. I remember, Eliza whispered. But did he ever choose you, Eli? The actual you? The question hung in the quiet room, traveling across the 100 miles of fiber optic cable that connected them. The reality was shockingly simple. He chose the version of me he could build a story around, Eliza confessed. The simple version. The one that made his own reflection look taller. That's not a partnership, Maya stated. That's brand management. After they disconnected, Eliza remained at the window, watching the steady flow of traffic on Storrow Drive. She thought back to being 26, fresh out of her doctoral program. Her father had expected her to take over European investments. Her brother, Leo, was already managing the family's tech acquisitions. Her future was a clear, straight line, a corner office overlooking the city, a life of quiet, immense power. But she had seen what that life cost. She saw her father become a ghost at his own dinner table, haunted by market fluctuations. She saw Leo become cynical, assessing every human interaction as a potential transaction. Every friendship was a networking play. Every relationship was a strategic alliance. Eliza rejected it. She dreamed of meeting someone in a crowded, ordinary coffee shop who would be captivated by nothing more than her laugh. She wanted a child who would scrape their knees in a public playground, not on the sprawling, manicured lawns of an estate. So she left. She moved to Boston, found a modest condo, and invented a backstory that was both believable and bland. She told people her family was in consulting. She said her father was happily retired. She lived on a tiny sliver of her royalty income, an amount that would have given her family's financial advisors a collective aneurysm. And, for a time, it felt real. Arthur loved her, or more accurately, he loved the character she played. The distinction between the two had taken 3 years to become clear, and now it was the only thing she saw. She left the nursery, retrieved his smartwatch from the bedside table, and set it on the gleaming kitchen island, right where he would find it. The screen was awake, displaying the shared calendar event. Then she walked to her study, powered on her encrypted laptop, and for the first time in a very long time, she logged into the Hayes Industries private server. Near a harbor dotted with racing yachts, she sat on a park bench watching a father, about her age, toss a giggling toddler into the sky. The child squealed with pure joy. The man's phone chimed. He looked at it, grinned, and shouted to his wife on a nearby boat. Maya got the reservation. Can you believe it? A sharp pain seized Eliza's chest. She couldn't believe it. She honestly could not. The baby rolled, a series of soft, insistent nudges from within. I hear you, Eliza whispered. I hear you. That evening, she went back to their waterfront apartment to get a textbook she needed. Arthur was in his home office, his voice drifting through the closed door, that smooth, persuasive tone that had once made her feel so safe. His tablet was on the kitchen counter, its screen lit, a cloud-based document was open, a business plan he was co-authoring. A recent comment from his partner was highlighted at the top. Commenter, Serafina Vance. The text read, Funding secured? Arthur's reply was just below it, almost. Eliza's next dividend payment will give us the seed capital we need. She won't question it. Eliza knew she was supposed to be at a charity dinner that night. She read the comment again, and a third time. Each word was a chisel, chipping away at the beautiful life she thought they were building. The seed capital, the one he never discussed with her because he never saw her as an investor. He had believed, with the unshakable confidence of a man who never had to ask, that Eliza Hayes was a spent force. No drive, no liquid assets, no network. He had married her thinking she was a retired wunderkind, a brilliant physicist content to be his brilliant wife and nothing more. And his business partner was clearly encouraging him to make sure she stayed that way, a beautiful, passive part of his public image. Eliza powered off the tablet. She pressed her palms down on the cold quartz countertop, grounding herself. The sub-zero refrigerator hummed softly. A fairy horn blared in the distance. The automated air freshener puffed out a cloud of cloying lavender. She thought about her private equity fund, quietly valued at over $300 million. She thought about her controlling shares in a portfolio of next-generation AI startups. She thought about the biotech advisory board she chaired, taking international calls from a converted guest room while Arthur and Serafina held their strategy sessions one floor below. They thought she was a postscript. They planned their future around her as if she were a painting, valuable, admired, but ultimately inanimate. The baby gave a single, powerful kick right into the center of her palm. "I know," Eliza whispered back. "We are not a postscript." The invitation had been magnetically clipped to the refrigerator for a month. The New England Innovation Awards, the most important event in Boston's tech and biotech calendar. Black tie, 500 attendees, an evening where careers were made and companies were born and spouses were expected to beam with supportive pride. 2 days prior, Serafina, Arthur's partner, had dropped off a dress box at the apartment. Inside was a dark, shapeless designer gown. "We really want the spotlight to be on Arthur's research tonight," Serafina had explained, running a hand over the matte silk. "This is elegant, but understated. It won't call attention to your situation." "My situation," Eliza echoed, her voice devoid of inflection. "A baby is a blessing, obviously, but on a night like this, the narrative is key." Eliza stared at the dress. It was a burial shroud, an expensive one, but a shroud all the same. "Thank you, Serafina. I'll think about it." She did not think about it. On the night of the awards, Eliza donned her own gown. It was sapphire blue, form-fitting silk, and exquisitely cut. It did not conceal her pregnancy. It celebrated it. 7 months of a new life, a proud, undeniable curve. She met her own gaze in the antique mirror. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she recognized the woman who had built a paradigm-shifting technology from her college dorm room. When she stepped into the living area, Serafina was already there, waiting by the door. Her expression shifted through 3 rapid-fire stages: surprise, then irritation, and finally, a cold, calculating appraisal. "You're wearing that," Serafina said. It was a statement of fact, not a question. "I am," Eliza confirmed. Arthur came in from the hall. He saw Eliza, and something sparked in his eyes. Perhaps it was pride, but it was immediately smothered by a nervous glance towards Serafina. There was always a glance towards Serafina. "You look incredible, Eli," he said, the compliment sounding thin. "She will be a distraction," Serafina muttered, grabbing her purse and sweeping out the door. The gala was held at the Institute of Contemporary Art, a glass and steel marvel cantilevered over the harbor. A string quartet was playing somewhere in the cavernous main hall. Arthur navigated the room like a seasoned politician, a warm hand on the shoulder for the men, a dazzling smile for the women. He was the celebrated visionary on the cusp of greatness. Serafina moved with the lethal grace of a predator, guiding Arthur from one venture capitalist to another. She introduced Eliza as Arthur's wife. The title was meant to be a definition, a box. He was the brand. Clara was the brand's architect. The launch party for the Sterling Spire, his new flagship skyscraper, was a universe of champagne and hushed power deals. Clara stood by the sprawling model of the tower, a hand resting on her swollen belly, sipping tonic water. She'd always been a master of observation. It's how you find the structural weaknesses in a design. That's when she caught it. Genevieve Sterling's voice, a blade wrapped in velvet. Clara's work is quaint, all that sustainable, community-focused design. It's lovely, but Liam needs vision. That's why Audrey is such a breath of fresh air. A polite, predatory chuckle from the circle of investors. They cast glances her way, a blend of dismissive sympathy and curiosity. They saw the pregnant wife, a beautiful but temporary distraction. Clara was less than 20 feet away. She heard the condescending praise for the other woman, the implication that she, the building's original consulting architect, was now obsolete. Liam was standing right beside his mother. He heard every word. Clara watched the sharp line of his jaw, waiting for him to interject, to defend her, to say, "Clara's designs are the foundation of this project." Even a slight turn in her direction would have been enough. He picked a flute of champagne from a passing tray. He raised it in a toast. He said nothing. His silence was an earthquake. Clara placed her glass on the edge of the display. She walked past the string quartet, past the raw bar, past a reporter trying to get a quote. She found an empty boardroom overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline. Stepping into the quiet, she sealed the glass door behind her. Her hands weren't shaking from humiliation, but from a cold, precise fury. It assembled itself in her mind like a blueprint, flawless and strong. This wasn't the kind of rage that shatters glass. It was the kind that lays a foundation, only to strategically rig it for demolition later. She clasped her hands together. "I am not a feature," she whispered to the city lights. "I am the architect." She stayed for exactly 5 minutes, breathing, strategizing. Then she smoothed down her silk dress and walked back to the party. Near the bar, a man approached her. Older, with the calm gravitas of old money and a watch that whispered, not shouted, its value. Simon Croft, the legendary developer who had first backed her own firm. "The man of the hour is a lucky fool," Simon said, his gaze sharp and knowing. "You're his center of gravity." He offered a thin smile. "Forgive me, your name was Beaumont before? As in, the Beaumont who won the Helios Prize for that solar tower design?" "It's a common enough name," Clara replied, her voice smooth as polished marble. Her posture was serene, but a vault door slammed shut behind her eyes. Simon was a man who'd built an empire by spotting stress fractures before anyone else. Her placid denial only confirmed his suspicion. "Enjoy the view," he said, but as he moved away, he discreetly tapped a message into his phone. Clara watched him disappear into the crowd. She felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in months. Not fear, not even anger. It was the thrill of the blank page, the moment before the first line is drawn, when anything is possible. She rejoined Liam, and he draped an arm over her shoulder. It felt like a zoning claim, not a hug. Later, in the car home, Liam sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through his phone, its blue light illuminating his triumphant smile. "Audrey Vance just sent over the revised penthouse mock-ups," he said, his voice buzzing. "Incredible! Pure genius! Genevieve and I are meeting her for brunch to discuss the next phase." Clara stared at the blur of streetlights. The silence in the car was deafening. "What revisions?" Clara asked. "Just some finishing touches," Liam said, not looking up from the screen. "A bolder aesthetic, better brand alignment." But his smile was private, intimate. Clara saw it reflected in the dark window, and in that reflection, she saw the complete, unsparing blueprint of his betrayal. The apartment was quiet when Clara got home from her checkup the next day. A deep, hollow quiet. The kind of quiet that means something integral has been removed. Her appointment had been stressful. Her blood pressure was elevated. Dr. Anya Sharma had peered at her over her glasses. "Are you under any unusual stress?" she'd asked. Clara had almost laughed. "Just the usual third trimester jitters," she'd lied. Dr. Sharma's expression was unconvinced. Listen to your body, Clara. A foundation under stress develops cracks. She drove home, those words echoing in her mind. Her body was telling her something, and so was the cold, empty space in her gut where a sense of home used to be. She pulled into their private garage and saw a sleek, unfamiliar sports car in the spot next to Liam's. The engine was silent, but she could feel the heat still radiating from the grill. It had been here a while. Clara walked into the apartment, her heels clicking on the marble floor, and went straight to the east wing. She wanted to see the nursery. She'd been thinking about the mural all day, a custom design of the night sky with constellations mapped in pinpricks of soft, glowing light, her last real act of creation in this home. She pushed open the door. The constellations were gone. The walls were a stark, aggressive charcoal gray. The smell of paint thinner hung in the air. The beautiful bassinet they'd found in a small shop in Vermont was gone. The mobile of delicate, interlocking brass birds her father had crafted was gone. The changing table, the bookshelf filled with architectural history books for children, the tiny plush lion her brother had sent from London, all of it had vanished. In its place stood a massive, dark mahogany desk, several leather club chairs, and a built-in wet bar. It wasn't a nursery. It was a study, a bachelor's den. A sterile, masculine armchair and a single orchid in a black vase completed the picture. The room had been completely gutted and reimagined as a monument to Liam Sterling. Clara stood frozen in the doorway, her purse slipping from her numb fingers. "Where's the nursery?" she asked, her voice a stranger's in the silence. "Oh, you're home!" Genevieve Sterling appeared from the adjoining room, adjusting a picture on the wall with the laser focus of someone who believes symmetry is next to godliness. "We can put the baby's things in the smaller guest room. I had the design team come this morning. Newborns don't really need a view, do they?" Liam agreed. "Liam agreed," Clara repeated, the words tasting like ash. "He thought it was practical. He thought it was practical to have our son's room dismantled while I was at my ultrasound." Genevieve finally turned. "Clara, I didn't dispose of anything important. It was just an empty room with a few decorations." A few decorations. 40 hours of design work, a custom color mixed to match the dawn sky. For over 6 months, she had been sourcing them, each one a first edition, a piece of a library for a daughter she had yet to meet. Inside each cover, she had written a personal inscription. Clara turned and walked toward Leo's study. He was on a conference call at his enormous mahogany desk. She stood silently in the doorway, a ghost in his world of finance, until he finally muted the call and looked up. "You let your mother donate my daughter's entire library." He took off his headset. "She was trying to clear some space. Be helpful." "I don't care what she was trying to be. I'm asking what you did, Leo." "Clara, you're being a bit hormonal right now." The word hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Hormonal, the one-word dismissal for any feeling a pregnant woman has that a man finds inconvenient. "I wrote in every single one of those books," Clara said, her voice quiet but dangerously steady, the calm before a storm that had been gathering for months. 62 individual inscriptions. I tracked those editions down myself. "We can just buy more books," Leo said, completely missing the point. "That is not the point." "Then what is the point?" Clara looked at him for 5 seconds, then 10. He was unmoved. He didn't understand. He genuinely could not comprehend why a woman would mourn a collection of words she had poured her soul into for the child growing inside her. "The point," she said, her voice chillingly serene, "is that you always choose her. You choose her every single time, without a moment's thought, without even the basic courtesy of pretending to hesitate." Leo sighed, a deep, frustrated sound. "You're escalating a simple clearing out into a major incident." "A major incident?" She laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "The library is a major incident. Books can be replaced, Clara. My mother is going to be a part of our lives. The baby won't care about some old paper." "I will care." She turned and walked out, down the long marble hallway, past the abstract painting she suddenly wanted to slash with a letter opener, up the sweeping staircase to her small office door, and into the cool, quiet air that smelled of paper and ink. The custom-built bookshelves were there, barren, like a skeleton picked clean. Her catalog, a leather-bound journal, sat on the desk. She opened it, reading the titles and the inscriptions she'd written, now just a record of ghosts. Clara sank into her chair, 8 months pregnant, in the office of a $10 million Chicago penthouse. She ran her hand over the empty shelf, the smooth, cold wood a stark reminder of the void. She began to read her inscriptions aloud, one by one, softly, patiently, the way you anchor yourself when you feel the world is about to come undone completely. Inscription by inscription, word by word. Her father ran the most feared litigation firm in the country. Her father dismantled corporate giants for breakfast. Her father had been on the cover of American Lawyer 4 times, and Clara was sitting in a silent office fighting for a handful of children's books. She closed the journal and picked up the single book that had been spared, left on her desk. The weak light from the window caught the gold foil on the cover, making it glimmer in the still air. "Enough," she whispered, a finality in the single word. Not for the baby, not for Leo, for herself. Enough. Her encrypted phone buzzed, a message from Marcus. "Just got a soft ping from a rival firm's security chief." Her father's text read, pure lawyer, concise and direct. "They were asking about Clara Bell, your old byline. I deflected, but honey, your cover story is getting thin." Clara looked at the book in her hands. She thought about cover stories, about disguises, about the quiet, unassuming freelance writer she had pretended to be for 3 years. "Maybe it's time it wore through," she typed back. The break didn't come with a shout. It came with a quiet click of a mouse. 2 days after the library was given away, Clara was in her office on a video call with Marcus. The door was closed, but not locked. She was going over discovery documents for one of his cases, routine work she did in stolen moments when the penthouse thought she was napping. She didn't hear him approach. "What are you hiding?" Leo was standing in the doorway, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the complex legal software displayed on her monitor. He had caught a name, a case file. Kensington versus Thorne. Clara closed the application. "I was on a private call. I heard you say Kensington versus Thorne. What is that? Some old case? Are you mixed up in something behind my back?" "It's a personal interest." Beatrice stepped into the room from behind him. "Are you in some kind of legal trouble? Is that it? Are you dragging my son into it? Because I told him. I said to run a full diligence report, but he said you were sweet. He said you were simple." Simple. Another word. Another cut. "I knew no woman just materializes with no connections to speak of," Beatrice continued, her voice gaining the vindicated fury of someone whose darkest suspicions have just been confirmed. "And now I find you whispering about corporate lawsuits. What are you, Clara? What are you really?" Clara rose from her chair. She had forgotten how much space she took up when she wasn't trying to be small. "I am your son's wife," she said. "I am carrying your granddaughter, and you are in my office, uninvited, demanding an explanation for my private conversations." "Your office?" Beatrice's laugh was a sharp, brittle sound. "This is Leo's home, our home. You brought nothing into it." The words were deliberate, sharpened to inflict the deepest wound. Every syllable was a brick in the wall Beatrice had been building around her from the day they first met. "You trapped my son with that baby," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "I see you so clearly, a nobody from nowhere who got a lucky break." The air in the room went still. Clara heard a floorboard creak. Leo was still in the doorway. He looked from his wife to his mother. Beatrice had tears welling in her eyes, a brilliant, perfectly timed performance. "What did you do to my mother?" Leo demanded. Clara just stared at him. "Ask her what she did to me." "She's crying, Clara." "She called me a nobody. She said I trapped you." Leo glanced at Beatrice, who was now dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that seemed to appear from nowhere. "I was just expressing my concern for my son. It was about the laptop, about the secrets," she said, her voice trembling with a controlled rage. "Mom, it's fine. Leo insisted, putting a protective arm around his mother, Beatrice. He shot a glare at Clara. She's 70 years old. Show some respect. Respect? Clara stopped, her jaw tight. She could feel a wave of heat travel up her chest, the baby inside her kicking as if sensing the surge of cortisol in her system. She remembered her obstetrician's advice. Asterisk, your body is telling you to remove the source of the stress. I'm leaving, Clara announced. Oh, fantastic, Leo scoffed. Theatrics. I am packing a bag, and I am going to a hotel. I will contact you when I am ready to have a discussion that doesn't involve your mother as a mediator. That's ridiculous. What's ridiculous is that I am 34 weeks pregnant and I don't feel safe in my own home. That word stopped him. Asterisk, safe asterisk. It wasn't a legal threat, but it carried its own kind of weight. For a split second, something flickered in his eyes. Was it concern, or was it calculation? Not for her, she knew, but for the optics. Clara packed one small suitcase, a few changes of clothes, her laptop, prenatal supplements, and her personal encrypted phone, which she slid into an outer pocket. She walked down the staircase, past Beatrice, past Leo, past the scent of expensive lilies that now seemed funereal, past the kitchen she once loved, and out the heavy front door. No one followed her. She took a cab 20 minutes to the peninsula, checking into Suite 1405, a corner room overlooking Lake Michigan. The suite smelled of clean linen and nothing else. No lilies, no Beatrice, no suffocating disappointment. She sat on the window seat, hugging her knees to her chest, the pose you take when you desperately need to hold yourself together because no one else will. An hour later, her phone buzzed. Leo's name appeared on the screen. Asterisk, this display is unproductive. Let me know when you're ready to be rational. A display. She was nearly 9 months pregnant, alone in a hotel room because his mother had accused her of being a gold-digging spy, and he called her response a display. She didn't reply. She set the phone on the nightstand, face down. The lights of the city sparkled across the water, distant and beautiful in the way things are when you're too numb to feel them. She ordered a truffle grilled cheese from room service. It arrived with a cloth napkin and a tiny bottle of sparkling water. She ate it on the floor, watching a documentary about deep-sea exploration on mute. 2 scientists were marveling at a bioluminescent jellyfish. She almost laughed at how ordinary it all was. The food, the television, the silence. It felt like the first breath of air after being trapped underwater for years. At 11 o'clock, she did something she had not done in a very long time. She called her father. It rang 1 time, 2 times. Marcus Thorne answered on the 3rd ring, his voice clear and alert, as if he'd been waiting by the phone. Clara! Just her name, but her own voice cracked on the response. Dad? A pause followed, the kind a parent instinctively understands how to read, a silence that measures the exact weight of a child's pain. Tell me everything, Marcus said. So she did. She told him all of it. The subtle insults, the arguments over the library, the gala, the condescending remarks about her family, the word simple, the word hormonal. Marcus listened without a single interruption. 3 years of carefully maintained distance evaporated in 20 minutes of unvarnished truth. When Clara finished, her father spoke with the quiet certainty he used in his closing arguments, right before a jury was about to deliver a verdict that would cost a corporation billions. I have honored your request to live your own life, Clara. I respected that. I respected your decisions, even when my every professional instinct told me this was a bad faith acquisition. But if that man and his mother compromise the health of my grandchild, I will stop being a silent observer. Is that understood? Elena squeezed her eyes shut. She had spent a decade running from her father's world, the weight of his name, the influence, the way Lorenzo could dismantle a competitor with a single email. But now, sitting on the floor of a suite at the peninsula, pregnant and completely alone, she didn't hear a captain of industry. She heard her dad. I understand, Elena whispered. I just wanted to be enough for him. she confessed to the empty room. But I was always competing with a woman who had a 35-year head start. You were never competing, Lorenzo said, his voice resolute. You were performing for an approval he was never going to give. The performance is over. Elena pulled the plush hotel robe tighter. The baby kicked gently, a soft reminder, like a small hand on her arm, whispering, I'm still here, asterisk. Me too, Elena whispered back, unsure if she was talking to the baby or herself. It was probably for both of them. Meanwhile, Richard Lowell hadn't been sleeping. The name Romano had been echoing in his mind for days. It was a name that felt significant, but he couldn't figure out why. He was sitting in his gallery office at 6 a.m, the Chicago skyline still a silhouette, and typed 2 words into the search bar, Romano Industries. The screen filled with results. He clicked on the first few articles, then a few more. He leaned back in his expensive chair and muttered a word his own mother would have been appalled to hear. $80 billion. Global manufacturing and engineering. Founded by Lorenzo Romano, number 9 on the Forbes list. And on the executive board, Elena M. Romano. Elena M. Romano. Richard's quiet wife, the artist with the modest trust fund. The woman his mother, Eleanor, had once called hawkery, charming, but terribly unambitious. Richard slammed his laptop shut. He opened it again. Then he grabbed his phone and called his business partner, David. Breakfast, he said. The office. 30 minutes. They sat in his private viewing room. Richard had black coffee. David had a bagel. Richard almost warned him he was going to need a scotch. How's Elena? David asked. She's fine, at a hotel. You know, pregnancy hormones are making things a little tense. Of course. And her family? What about them? Richard asked, rearranging a small sculpture on his desk. What is it her father did? He's retired, owns some little fabrication shop in Milan, I think. She almost never mentions them. Nothing important. David placed his coffee mug down with deliberate care, the kind of motion you make when you're trying to control a tremor in your hands. Richard, have you ever actually looked up your wife's family? What? Her maiden name. Romano. Have you ever just researched it? Richard let out a self-assured laugh, the kind a man makes when he believes he holds all the cards. Why in the world would I need to do that? Indulge me, David said. What is this actually about? Just do it. Richard sighed and pulled out his phone. He typed the name. He waited. His expression began to shift, not all at once, but in slow, painful degrees, like watching a masterpiece fade in direct sunlight. First came the confused frown, then a flash of disbelief, and finally the nauseating, gut-wrenching realization that the foundation he'd built his life on was nothing but sand. This has to be some kind of mistake. It's not, David said quietly. I had my analyst confirm it. Your wife is the sole heir to Lorenzo Romano. She sits on the board of a corporation that's worth more than the entire Magnificent Mile. Including us. Richard just stared at his phone, the untouched bagel forgotten. His face was a cascade of emotions, shock, denial, fear, a burst of anger, and then more fear, humiliation. And at last, the one feeling that truly defined him, the one Elena had always sensed hiding beneath the surface, calculation. His first thought wasn't, asterisk, I have failed her completely. His first thought wasn't, asterisk, I have to go to her and beg for her forgiveness. His first thought, visible in the slight clenching of his jaw and the way his gaze turned inward, was, asterisk, how do I manage this situation so I don't lose my connection to that kind of influence? Don't even start, David said softly. Whatever strategic move you're mapping out in your head, erase it. I'm not mapping anything out. Yes, you are. And let me tell you, as someone who's been in this world for 20 years, you are so far out of your depth, you can't even see the surface. You're not just playing chess against a grandmaster, you're playing a game you don't even know the rules to. Richard left the gallery without saying another word. He sat in his car in the parking garage, the engine silent, his hands clenched on the steering wheel. He remained there for nearly an hour, replaying everything. Every dismissive comment his mother had ever made. Every single time he had let her belittle his wife's art. The argument over the nursery, the gallery opening, the word dramatic, the words sensitive, the prenuptial agreement he had demanded. He had married the heiress to an $80 billion empire. She had concealed it from him because she wanted to be loved for who she was, and he had failed that simple test so completely that the failure itself was a monumental achievement. He called Elena. It went to voicemail. He called again and again and again. Each unanswered ring felt like another brick in the wall he had meticulously built between them. Across the city, Elena was on a video conference with a team of 6 architects. She was reviewing the final blueprints for a new contemporary art museum in Singapore. Operations in 17 countries. Endowments were up 8%. She was confident, articulate, and decisive. The people on the call addressed her as Miss Romano. They listened without interruption when she spoke. They took careful notes. Nobody would have dreamed of questioning her authority. When the meeting ended, she closed her laptop, glanced down at her pregnant belly, and said in a voice that was light years away from the one she used in the boardroom, "Your aunt is going to raise his entire world to the ground." The text lit up the screen at 9 that night. Sophia Romano, her older sister, 5 feet 5 inches of Milanese elegance, with a gaze that had never encountered intimidation and intended to keep it that way. She walked into the Chicago apartment, looked around, and then looked at Elena on the sofa, her swollen ankles propped up on pillows. "This is your safe house," she stated. It was not a question. "It is just temporary, Sophia. You have been designing a life with a man who does not deserve to critique your color palette, let alone share your studio." Our father said something similar. Dad is correct. Dad is always correct. Do not ever let him know. I admitted that she sat on the arm of the sofa for a moment, and the ruthless lawyer was gone, replaced by the older sister, the one who taught her how to mix oil paints, the one who got a college professor fired for dismissing her portfolio. "Elena, I love you, and I respect your independence, but this is not independence. This is a retreat, and the woman I know does not retreat. I loved him." Sophia, she used the past tense. Elena would not meet her eyes. The silence that followed was a complete answer in itself. To make a world for him, she had made her own smaller, Elena confessed. She just hadn't realized his was the size of a jewelry box. Marco reached over and squeezed her hand. He didn't offer easy reassurances. Sometimes, with Marco, that was everything. That evening, Victoria was at Dominic's downtown condo. She had been moving Elena's curated art pieces, searching for weaknesses. Weaknesses in what, she wasn't sure, but disdain was Victoria's native tongue, and she was fluent. On a marble console, a misdelivered package sat unopened. Inside, she found a rare auction catalog. On the first page, an inscription in Dominic's handwriting. "For the only collection that matters. V." Victoria smiled. It wasn't jealousy she felt, but the thrill of a hostile takeover. She assumed it was some forgotten trinket, a relic from a life Elena had curated. She brought it to Dominic. He was on the terrace, his face illuminated by his phone. He'd been glued to it for hours. "Your wife's dusty old world is calling," Victoria teased. She held up the book. An art catalog, can you imagine? So academic. Dominic glanced at the book, then at Victoria. For the first time in their year-long affair, he saw her clearly, the casual cruelty she branded as honesty, the transactional nature she called love, the sheer emptiness of her life that she filled with other people's things. But he stayed silent because admitting a mistake would be to admit he was wrong, and Dominic Sterling, in his 39 years, had never been wrong. The phone in his hand vibrated. A new encrypted message flashed on the screen. It was from Marco Moretti, Elena's brother. The message contained a single attachment, a preliminary SEC filing. It questioned the capital sources for Dominic's largest fund, the one underwritten by 3 investors from her father's network. Victoria read the sender's name over his shoulder. Her perfectly contoured face went pale. The morning after the catalog's arrival, Dominic Sterling woke at 4 a.m. He hadn't slept. He had lain in his bespoke bed in his $10 million condo and watched the skyline, where the fog was rolling in off the lake, obscuring everything. He showered and put on his finest suit. It was the charcoal one he wore to board meetings. He checked his reflection. He looked like a man who commanded respect. He had never felt more like an imposter. He drove to a historic building on the Gold Coast. He didn't have the address. He found it on a shared philanthropic donor list. He sat in the lobby and called Elena. She answered on the second ring. "I know," he said. "You know what, Dominic? About Victoria, about the condo, about everything." A pause for 2 heartbeats. Then, "How?" "The catalog," he said. "It arrived at the gallery yesterday." Another longer silence. "I need to see you," he said. "I am in Marco's lobby. I will be right down." She appeared 3 minutes later. She wore tailored trousers and a simple silk blouse. No jewelry, no makeup. Her hair pulled back in a severe knot. She looked like the brilliant art historian he had first met, the version of her he had encouraged her to soften. But something else was new. She carried herself with the unshakable confidence of someone who has authenticated a masterpiece and will entertain no further debate. "Elena," his voice cracked. "Sweetheart, I had no idea. Why didn't you just tell me? We could have what? We could have been a dynasty, built a legacy. I would have treated you." He let the words hang there, waiting for her to absolve him. He watched her see the admission for what it was. "Differently," she finished for him. "You would have treated me differently." "That is not." "No, that is precisely what you mean. If you had known my brother was a forensic accountant, you would have been more careful. You just admitted it. And Dominic, that is the whole point." He dragged a hand through his hair, the old nervous habit from when a deal was collapsing. "I gave you 7 years, Elena said, her voice steady, boardroom steady. "I gave you every opportunity to value the partner who was building a life with you, not just the asset you thought you could acquire. You failed, not because you had a mistress, but because you never believed our marriage was your most valuable holding. Because when your friends called me your cultural hobby," you smiled. "When Victoria sold the Venetian mirror my grandmother left me, you called it an upgrade. When I told you I felt erased, you told me I was being overly dramatic. My mistress, she's just ambitious. Your mistress called my family heirloom gaudy clutter, and you called it portfolio management. She called me a sentimental liability. She told you to protect your brand from my emotional attachments, and you agreed. Every single time, you agreed." Dominic's eyes were shining, but Elena had learned to distinguish the tears of a man in pain from a man in trouble. These belonged to the latter. He wasn't crying because he was sorry. He was crying because he was caught. The lobby's glass doors swung open. Victoria, she had tracked him. She marched in wearing a leather jacket and a thunderous expression. "Dominic, what are you doing here? We need a communications plan." She stopped when she saw Elena. Her lip curled. "We need to go home, Dominic," she said. "This little sideshow is over." "Dominic," Elena said, just his name, a quiet finality. "I will not be spoken to." A black town car glided to the curb. The door opened. A man stepped out, 6'2", silver at the temples, wearing a suit that cost more than a car. He looked like a statesman. He moved like a king. Lorenzo Moretti walked into the lobby. Marco was 2 steps behind him. The room suddenly felt like a hostile negotiation. Lorenzo looked at Victoria, his gaze calm and appraising, the kind one gives to a clever forgery. "You must be the woman who deemed my late wife's heirloom to be clutter," Lorenzo said. Victoria's mouth opened and closed. She resembled a goldfish that had just met a barracuda. We were simply updating the aesthetic," Victoria stammered. "She was not updating," Lorenzo said. "She was building a home. There is a difference. I raised my daughter to know that a life should be built on a foundation of trust, not on speculative assets. You have proven why she was right to hedge her bets." Victoria looked at Dominic, waiting for him to intervene. to defend her, to be her man. Dominic stood frozen between his mistress and his wife, between the woman who had mirrored his ambition for a year and the woman he had betrayed for 7. He said nothing. The silence lasted 12 seconds. Elena counted. An old habit from curating museum exhibits, Lorenzo took his daughter's arm. "Shall we go home?" he said softly, as if they were leaving a tedious opera and not the ruins of a marriage. Elena looked at Dominic one last time. She searched his face for contrition, for comprehension, for the smallest sign that he understood not what he was losing, but what he had discarded. She found a faint trace, a flicker of the man who had sat with her in a Florentine piazza and asked her to design their life together. But a flicker isn't a foundation. A flicker cannot hold up a home, and she was done taking shelter in condemned structures. "Goodbye, Dominic," she said. She walked out of the lobby into the Chicago air. It was October again, a full circle. The last of the leaves were falling, gold and rust and the bruised purple of twilight. Marco held the car door open. She got in carefully, 7 months pregnant, and carrying a future that was entirely her own. She was finally letting go of the past. As the car pulled away, her father's phone rang. Lorenzo did not answer. Marco did. "Yes," Marco said. "This is Mr. Moretti's son and representing counsel. How can I help you?" A pause, then Dominic's lawyer said something Marco would later describe as the sound of a man realizing he'd just been served a lawsuit chiseled in marble. 3 of Mr. Sterling's largest backers. Sterling Capital is reviewing all active partnerships, and our board is requesting immediate liquidation of your outstanding capital investment. Marco's voice on the phone was crisp, devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a man who had waited 3 years for this exact moment. "Thank you, Marco," Elena said. "We'll handle the rest from here." She looked out the panoramic window of her new apartment, not with triumph, but with a quiet sense of release. Below, the lights of Chicago glittered against the dark water of Lake Michigan. Her father, Lorenzo, reached over and took her hand. He said nothing, he just held it. "You know," Elena said softly, "I spent so long running from all of this." "I know," Lorenzo squeezed her hand, "but you weren't running from us." 6 weeks later, the baby arrived. Elena had settled into a historic graystone in Lincoln Park. Marco found it for her, 4 bedrooms, a walled garden, and original oak floors that groaned when you walked, which Elena cherished. It meant she could always hear someone coming. Marco lived 4 blocks away. Lorenzo had leased the entire penthouse floor of the building next door, claiming it was a temporary corporate residence, which in Lorenzo's world meant he was moving in for good, but would pretend it was temporary to honor her need for autonomy. The nursery was the first room Elena completed. She painted the mural herself, the Chicago skyline rendered in soft blues and grays, with 42 different architectural marvels hidden in the details. It was the same artistic passion, the same steady hand, but on walls that deserved it. She painted the Willis Tower above the crib, the Art Institute by the window, and the Monadnock building near the door. It took her 3 entire weekends. No one interfered. No one painted over her work. No one suggested the room required different lighting. The divorce papers were delivered on a Wednesday. The process was efficient, private, with no leaks to the press. Dominic's legal team had prepared the case with the surgical precision of a group that had been waiting for this day for 3 years. Richard contested. His lawyer, Henderson, called Dominic to open negotiations. The call lasted fewer than 12 minutes. "My client is prepared to discuss an equitable distribution of assets," Henderson started. "Your client's assets are valued at $60 million, a significant portion of which was financed by venture capital firms that are subsidiaries of my client's family," Dominic responded. "My client directs an $80 billion industrial empire through irrevocable trusts that were established decades before this marriage. There is nothing to distribute." A thick silence hung on the line. "The penthouse," Henderson tried, "is in your client's name. He can have it, along with that absurdly overpriced espresso machine." "What about—" Dominic interrupted him. Let me be perfectly clear. Your client married a Romano and for 3 years allowed his mother to mock her career and re-gift her birthday presents. There is no scenario in which he comes out ahead. The only question is how much of his dignity he manages to keep when this is over. Richard conceded, though not with dignity. His business unraveled in stages. The termination of capital support from Romano-backed firms triggered default clauses in his loans. 2 major gallery acquisitions were canceled indefinitely. His primary investor withdrew after learning the personal details, not the financial ones, the other ones. It seemed that permitting your mother to belittle your pregnant wife was not a character trait that fostered long-term business confidence. He lost the penthouse 2 months later, not to Elena, but to the bank. His net worth plunged from $60 million to $15 and then to $7. Eleanor called Elena one time. The conversation lasted 45 seconds. I feel I ought to apologize, Eleanor said, her voice stiff with resentment. It was the statement of a CEO announcing a necessary, if unpleasant, restructuring. For what, exactly? Clara asked. For any misunderstanding that has occurred. There was no misunderstanding, Genevieve. You knew exactly who I was. You just decided I didn't matter. I wasn't aware of your professional history. That is precisely my point. You were aware I was your son's wife and the mother of your grandchild, and you decided that wasn't enough. A long silence stretched across the line. I hope you find what you're looking for, Clara said. She meant it, not with warmth or malice, but with the dispassionate finality of an architect signing off on a demolition permit. She ended the call, placed the phone on the table, and looked around her new apartment. The nursery wall was painted with a mural of the city skyline. The crib was assembled, and a mobile of tiny, famous buildings gently spun in the morning light. The baby came on a crisp October Tuesday. A cool breeze blew in off the Hudson, making the world feel clear and bright. Clara's water broke at 2 a.m. Her brother, Michael, drove her to the hospital. Simon Croft, her mentor and new business partner, was there when they arrived. Her new head of security, a stoic man named Marcus, appeared 10 minutes later and began to patrol the hallway like a panther who found the scent of fluorescent lighting deeply offensive. Dr. Sharma delivered the baby at 6:47 a.m. A boy, 7 pounds, 2 ounces. He had a shock of dark hair and blue eyes that would one day turn the color of a stormy sea. He is structurally sound, Dr. Sharma announced with a smile. Clara held her son, feeling the solid, real, profound weight of him. A life filled with potential and all the beautiful, soaring structures she had yet to design. James, Clara whispered. His name is James. For her grandfather, a stonemason. Michael wept. He hadn't cried since their father passed away. He stood by the window, tears streaming down his face in silent, astonished joy. Simon held James for exactly 30 seconds before handing him back, his own composure visibly rattled. He's so compact, he said, his voice rough. Are they supposed to be that small? He's a healthy weight, Simon. He should have a bigger security detail. He should have 2. He doesn't need 2 security details, Clara said, laughing. He has us. Liam requested to be there. Clara refused. He met his son 2 days later under supervision. Michael was there, not as her brother, but as her lawyer. Liam sat stiffly in a chair by the hospital window. Clara placed James in his arms. He held him the way one holds a priceless, explosive artifact, with a dawning terror that he was touching something real. He cried, not for Clara, not for their marriage, and not for the Sterling Empire, which was now under investigation by the city for code violations she had anonymously reported. For the first time, Liam Sterling cried because he understood with devastating clarity what he had demolished. It wasn't just a partnership with a talented architect. It was this, the warm, trusting weight of his own child, the quiet peace on his sleeping face, and the woman across the room who would have built a world for him if only he hadn't torn down her design. He has your mouth, Liam murmured, his voice broken. He has his own mouth, Clara replied. A week later, something unexpected happened. Audrey Vance called. Clara almost let it go to voicemail. She knew the name. The woman Genevieve had positioned as Liam's next great project. Miss Beaumont, Clara, Audrey started, her voice tight with nerves. I know this is the last thing you want. I almost didn't call. What can I do for you, Audrey? I needed you to know. Genevieve came to me. She systematically put me in Liam's path. She described your marriage like a property she was planning to flip. She gave me his private schedule, told me what to wear, what to say. I get it. And now she's telling everyone you were a schemer, that you hid your family's background to trap him. I just didn't think that was fair. I thought you should hear it from someone who was actually there. Clara was quiet for a long time. She sat on the velvet couch in her brother's study, her daughter Amelia asleep on her chest, the baby's soft, rhythmic breaths a comfort against her skin. Thank you, Chloe. And for the record, I saw the press release about your new gallery. It's wonderful. Clara laughed, a real startled sound that came from the unexpected kindness of a near stranger. Thank you, she said once more. After hanging up, she sat with Amelia for a while. The Pacific Heights townhome was still. Fog rolled past the large bay window. The old house groaned and settled around them. Her brother Marcus was bringing home Thai food later. Her father was upstairs on a video call with a museum director in Tokyo. The world outside was huge and chaotic, full of people making decisions, some good, some terrible, some that would cast a shadow over their entire lives. Clara looked down at her daughter. Amelia's tiny fist was clenched tightly around her index finger. Fierce, unbreakable. I will never, ever again make myself smaller for another person, Clara whispered to her, and neither will you. 1 year later, Clara Beaumont was on the cover of Art and Tech magazine. Not because of the divorce, not because of Julian Vance, and certainly not because of the tabloid story about a secret heiress. Marcus's legal team had vaporized that storyline with a barrage of cease and desist orders that moved like a flash flood. The cover story was about the Beaumont Foundation, the new philanthropic wing of her family's arts council. It had just finalized its most ambitious project to date, a partnership with a robotics firm to digitally archive ancient manuscripts across 3 continents. The deal had taken 3 years to orchestrate, and Clara had personally spearheaded the final negotiations. The photograph showed her standing in a climate-controlled vault, dressed in a sharp black pantsuit and a simple cashmere shell. She looked directly at the camera, her expression neither smiling nor stern, but perfectly, completely composed. The headline made no mention of her private life. It was a Wednesday in September. 1 year since finding the jeweler's receipt. 1 year since the silent drive across the Golden Gate Bridge to her brother's house. 1 year since the phone call to her father that had changed the course of her entire world. Clara sat in her office on the 42nd floor of the Salesforce Tower. The view stretched across the San Francisco Bay all the way to the Marin Headlands. The afternoon sun cast a diamond-like shimmer over the water. In a corner of the office was a designated play area. Amelia was in it, happily gumming a soft block shaped like the Coit Tower. Above her, a custom-made mobile dangled tiny, sterling silver models of the Bay Area's iconic bridges. Clara had commissioned it from a local artist piece by piece. She'd kept it, not as a reminder of her heartbreak, but as proof that even the most fractured connections could be remade into something beautiful. Her desk was organized, a laptop, a cup of green tea, a stack of grant proposals, and a small framed crayon drawing from Marcus's son that read, Best Aunt Clara. Her phone buzzed, a text from Julian. He sent one every few weeks, always courteous, always brief, and always about Amelia. How is she? Did she like the Monet board book I sent? Can I see her on Saturday? Clara responded only when the questions were about their child. The us that had once existed was now just a memory she'd filed away. She typed a reply. Amelia loves the book. She tried to eat the water lily. Saturday is fine for a visit. Dad will coordinate. She set the phone down and watched Amelia. The baby was now pulling herself up, holding the edge of her playmat, swaying but balanced. Her bright green eyes were fixated on the mobile of the San Francisco skyline. "You like that, little one?" Clara said. Amelia babbled a sound that was almost a word. She reached for the Golden Gate Bridge, her tiny fingers grasping at the air. "You'll get there," Clara said. "Not right away, but you will." The intercom on her desk chimed. Her assistant's voice came through. "Mrs. Beaumont, your father is on line 1. Perfect, she thought. She picked up the receiver. "Dad, I saw the feature," her father said. "You look powerful. I feel tired." "That's the same thing when you're building a legacy," he replied. Clara smiled. "How's the Amsterdam acquisition?" "On track. How's my granddaughter?" "Currently trying to deconstruct a stuffed sea lion." "A fine girl," he said, "testing the limits of her world." They talked for 10 minutes about museum-grade humidity controls. They didn't talk about Julian. They had stopped talking about Julian months ago, not because the subject was too raw, but because it had become irrelevant. After the call, Clara walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. 42nd floor. The city was a glittering tapestry below, a network of light, motion, and a million individual lives. She was wearing simple jeans and a soft wool sweater. Her hair was up in a messy bun. A mug of now lukewarm tea was on her desk. She was the same woman Julian had met at a gallery opening in New York. She had always been this woman in all her forms, the one who loved historical biographies, the one who could negotiate a multi-million-dollar art acquisition, the one who got teary-eyed at commercials with puppies, the one who could spot a forgery from 20 paces. She was all of those things. She had just stopped pretending she was only the parts he found convenient. She thought of Julian, not with rage or even regret, but with the deep, calm clarity that comes after a wildfire when the smoke clears and you can see the new growth already beginning to sprout. He wasn't a villain. He was just a man who'd never had to be resilient, raised in a world his mother, Beatrice, had painstakingly constructed to be frictionless and small, demanding no real strength. Julian chose the path of least resistance at every opportunity, not out of malice, but because he was profoundly unaware any other path was available. That, she knew, was his story to navigate, not hers to rewrite. She thought of Beatrice, a woman so frightened of her son escaping her influence that she methodically undermined every serious relationship he ever had. A woman who measured people by their usefulness and wrote them off the second they became an inconvenience. A woman who had looked at Clara's growing pregnancy and called their baby a logistical issue. Clara didn't hate Beatrice. She saw her with perfect clarity, which was, in a way, more painful. Understanding the person who hurt you denies you the simple comfort of branding them a monster. You have to accept the reality that they were just people, insecure, afraid, and causing devastating harm with the same hands they probably used to soothe their own children when they were small. And then she thought of herself, the woman who had made herself smaller, who had muted her own opinions, who had counted her breaths instead of speaking her truth. The woman who stayed in spare bedrooms and renovated attics and soulless hotel suites because she thought that love meant you had to chip away pieces of yourself to make a better fit. That woman wasn't gone. She was a part of Clara's past. She would always be there, but she was no longer in control. Amelia pushed herself up in the play area, her small legs shaking as she found her balance. She took one wobbly step, then another, before her diapered bottom landed on the soft mat with a gentle bounce. She looked up at her mother, her expression one of pure shock and accomplishment. Clara laughed and knelt down beside the enclosure. "That was 2, she whispered. "That was 2 whole steps." Amelia's tiny hands reached for the mobile of sculptures above her, the polished bronze form still just out of reach, but closer than they had been yesterday. "Come here," Clara said. She lifted her daughter out, settling the familiar, perfect weight on her hip, and walked to the window. The sun was melting below the San Francisco skyline, smearing the clouds with shades of burnt orange and deep purple, with that stunning temporary blue that only appears for a moment between sunset and dark. The city lights began to prick the twilight. You see all of that? Clara murmured, her lips close to her daughter's tiny ear. That's the world. It's huge and loud, and sometimes it is deeply unfair. People will try to define you. They will hear your name and make judgments. They will look at you and see only what they expect to see. Amelia tangled a hand in her mother's hair. But you are a Beaumont, and Beaumont women build their own damn museums. She kissed her daughter's cheek, breathing in the clean, fresh scent of baby shampoo and new possibilities. The mobile in her apartment nursery would be catching the lights from the bay tonight, casting shadows on the walls, a collection of shapes inspired by the world's great female artists. Frida for resilience, Georgia for vision, Yayoi for infinity, and Amelia, the brightest star of them all, the one who wasn't just a shape on a wall, but a warm, living masterpiece in her arms. Clara turned from the window, placed Amelia back in the play area, and sat down at her own desk. She opened her laptop. There was work to be done. There was always work to be done. But first, she picked up her mug of tea and took a sip. It was cold. She drank it anyway. Cold tea, a well-worn book on art preservation, and the quiet, unshakable satisfaction of a woman who had finally stopped asking for permission to live her own life. For 3 years, she had drifted through a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, a ghost in her own home. The room meant to be a nursery had been converted into a high-tech gym without a word to her. Her name, once celebrated in art circles, was now just an accessory to his. Her pregnancy was dismissed as an inconvenience, her valid concerns waved away as just pregnancy brain, and her decision to leave was called an emotional outburst. For 3 years, she had convinced herself that to be loved meant to shrink. That was over. She finally understood the cage had never been locked. She had held the key the entire time, trading her principles for security, her voice for a quiet life, choosing to be compliant because it was easier. Easier meant avoiding conflict, and a life without conflict was a life without passion. Never again. Her gaze fell to the tablet on her polished oak desk. Her own work stared back at her, the featured artist in a major online gallery, her digital paintings praised for their raw, unyielding power. She wasn't smiling in the photo, just looking directly at the viewer, confident, grounded, here to stay. She picked up her phone and messaged Ben, "I'm opening a bottle of that ridiculously expensive whiskey tonight. You in?" Ben's response was almost instant, already in the Uber, "And I'm bringing a second bottle because I know you." Amelia felt a genuine smile spread across her face as she set the phone down. She took one last look out the floor-to-ceiling window. Chicago was igniting, one skyscraper at a time, a constellation of defiant lights holding back the night. She was part of that now. She walked into her studio, not because it was the biggest room in her new loft, but because the view was the most inspiring, and she was finished with living in the shadows. A closing note: this story was meticulously conceived, written, and refined by our dedicated team to bring our readers compelling tales that explore genuine human struggles and provide a deep, resonant experience.